Hi there, this is Mr. Wolf. We're here doing benchmark 23. I can recognize and use the properties of rectangles, squares, and rhombuses. Um, we've got a rectangle, we've got a square, and this over here, this is a rhombus. You couldn't think of a rhombus as just a square with a little bit of a tilt on it. So all the sides are equal, but not all the angles are equal. And we're going to get into the properties of these during this lesson. As always, make sure that you have pencil and paper out to take down a few notes, particularly for this benchmark, since there's a lot of properties to understand in order to solve the problems. You'll remember from our last benchmark, we started working on parallelograms. And in our Venn diagram here, we can see that in the big oval, we're talking about quadrilaterals. Quad meaning four. So all these shapes inside here have four sides. And within those, we have parallelograms, we have trapezoids, and we could also include kites here if we wanted. And within parallelograms, we've got three different types of parallelograms: rectangles, squares, and rhombuses. And you can see from the Venn diagram that squares actually have the properties of both rectangles and rhombuses. So let's get right into each of these shapes. Hey, before we do though, I'm going to ask you a question. The question is, why was the mathematician late for work? I'll reveal the answer later in the video. Alright, first we're going to start with rectangles. Every rectangle is a parallelogram, so it will exhibit the exact same properties that parallelograms do, which are these. Opposite sides are congruent, opposite angles are congruent, consecutive interior angles are supplementary, and the diagonals bisect each other. Okay, so all those properties are true for all parallelograms, including rectangles, squares, and rhombuses. Let's look at what makes a rectangle different, since that's what we're really concerned with. Okay, one property, the angles. All four interior angles are 90 degrees. Regarding the sides, same thing as before. Opposite sides are congruent. Regarding the diagonals in a rectangle are congruent. So they still bisect each other. That means they cut them in half, each other in half right here. But this diagonal is congruent to this diagonal. Okay, so two additional properties for rectangles, write those down. This goes on further to tell us what is different about a rectangle. What I particularly like here is this box. All the properties of a parallelogram plus four right angles, and the diagonals are congruent. Okay, so if you just get this box down, that will be enough. Next, let's look at a rhombus. And before we move forward, a little English syntax. If you want to talk about more than one rhombus, you could say rhombuses, or you can say rhombi. Either one means more than one rhombus, or the plural form of rhombus. So every rhombus is a parallelogram, so they'll all exhibit these same properties. Opposite sides are congruent, opposite angles are congruent, consecutive angles are supplementary, and the diagonals bisect each other. So let's look at what makes a rhombus different. The differences are here. First of all, the angles. The diagonals actually bisect each angle into two congruent angles. So this angle right here is congruent to this angle right here. And same thing here, here, and all the way around. Next, all four sides are congruent. That's why you see these marks here, 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 and here. Last, the diagonals are perpendicular. They are not congruent, but they do cross at a right angle, which is why you see this box right here showing us that they cross at right angles. So to summarize, a rhombus has all the properties of a parallelogram plus four congruent sides, the diagonals bisect the angles, and the diagonals are perpendicular. Okay. Last, let's talk about squares. So squares exhibit the same properties of a parallelogram. So let's look at what makes a square unique. Well, it exhibits the properties of a parallelogram, a rectangle, and a rhombus, all combined. So everything, all the properties, squares got them. All four interior angles are 90 degrees. The diagonals bisect each other into two congruent angles. Regarding the sides, all four sides are congruent, and the diagonals are congruent, and diagonals are perpendicular. Okay, so here's all of that summed up. A square, hey, look at me. I have all the properties of the parallelogram and the rectangle and the rhombus. I have it all. Yay me. Okay, so here we are back again in our Venn diagram. We had some properties for rectangles, we had some properties for rhombuses, and of course squares are the same. All right, a square has the properties of a rectangle and a rhombus and a parallelogram. So squares can kind of do it all. Hey, let's answer the riddle from earlier. Why was the mathematician late? Because he took the rhombus. The rhombus, get it? Like the wrong bus, but rhombus. Okay, I'll let you stop laughing and then you can move forward here. All right, let's look at some practice problems here so we can get an idea of why we need to understand these properties. Here it says a woodworker constructs a rectangular picture frame so that JK is 50 and JL is 86. So let me label J to K is 50 and JL is 86. And they want us to find HM from here to here. All right, so if I know that this here is 86, I know that the diagonals are congruent in a rectangle. So this has to be 86 as well. And I also know that the diagonals bisect each other. So if they're asking for H to M, which is this segment here, it's got to be half of 86. So I just take my 86, cut it in half, and we find out the answer is 43. All right, let's look at another problem here. How about something with a rhombus? Here they're asking us to find angle VTZ, VTZ. So this little angle right here, okay, they've already told me that this little angle here is 5A minus 5. Okay, and they've told me that this angle right here is 14A plus 20. Well, I already know that one of the properties of a rhombus is that the diagonals cross at a right angle. So I know that this angle here has to equal 90. I'm going to subtract 20 from each side, subtract 20. I find out that 14A equals 70. And if I divide each side by 14, I'll figure out that A equals 5. Now that I know that A equals 5, I can come up here and plug it in because I know that this angle and my angle are congruent because the diagonals bisect the angles. That's one of the properties we learned. So if I plug 5 in here, 5 times 5 is 25, minus 5 equals 20. So I know my angle is 20. Here's another one. We know the sides are congruent on a rhombus, so set those equal to each other. Okay, here's one for each one of the shapes. Of course, you've got to know that the sides of all squares are all congruent, so set these equal. Over here, you got to know that this is a right angle, so we can use Pythagorean theorem. A squared plus b squared has got to equal c squared. And over here, you've got to know that consecutive angles in any parallelogram, including a rhombus, are supplementary. So when added together, these two are going to equal 180. So you can see how just knowing the properties helps us set up the problems in order to solve for the variable. Okay, and here's a table here. And what you might do is copy this table down. So we've got all three shapes at the top, and then we've got all the various properties listed down the left side here. And then you can go through and check which ones does each property belong to. Okay, we already know the opposite sides are congruent in all parallelograms. Same with opposite angles. Consecutive angles are supplementary in all parallelograms. And the diagonals always bisect each other. Now, here's where it gets a little different. All sides are congruent. Well, that's true for a rectangle, but not, or excuse me, for a square, but not for a rectangle. And it is true for a rhombus. Remember, a rhombus is just like a square, but with a slant on it. All the angles are congruent in a square, they're all right, and in a rectangle, they're all right, but not in a rhombus. The diagonals are congruent in a square and in a rectangle, but not in a rhombus. The diagonals are perpendicular in a square, not in a rectangle, but they are in a rhombus. And the diagonals bisect the angles in a square, not a rectangle, but in a rhombus. So if you look, one really easy way to remember is, look, a square has all the properties, okay? And then there's only a couple properties where rectangles and rhombuses are different, okay? Not all the angles are congruent, not all the sides are congruent. The diagonals aren't necessarily congruent, and so forth. Okay, so you might pause and jot this down, and let's just summarize here. We've learned about squares, rectangles, and rhombuses. We know that all three shapes exhibit the properties of all parallelograms, in that opposite sides are congruent, opposite angles are congruent, consecutive angles are supplementary, and diagonals bisect each other. Okay, there are some specific properties for each one, and those include congruent, all sides congruent. Those include diagonals bisecting each other, or the diagonals being perpendicular. Okay, all of those properties are in your notes now, so you shouldn't have any problem. Make sure you complete the quiz to demonstrate that you watched this video, and make sure you've got notes to show that you watched the video as well. If you don't have notes and you didn't take the quiz, you will have to watch the video over in class. Remember, as always, if you need help, shoot me a text or post a question on the YouTube page. For benchmark 23, this is Mr. Wolf signing off.